let's move on to talk about another very thorny topic which has been in the news this week, Ian, and that is the tragic death of Peter Lynch, who was one of the people who got caught up in this summer's riots. He was arrested in Rotherham, if I'm remembering correctly. He is not someone who, as far as we can tell from what the judge said, is he was handing down his pretty lengthy, more than 2-year sentence. That he wasn't someone who was involved in the violence necessarily, but was someone who was very much involved in the mob, if you like. He was gesticulating, he was shouting at police officers, he was getting into a bit of a tussle with police officers to some extent. It was revealed this week that he had tragically taken his own life in prison, and it has, I suppose, sparked those debates again about whether or not, in the midst of and in the wake of the summer's riots, whilst everyone was behind locking up the violent individuals and the people who were menacing asylum seekers and so on, was there an overreaction with some of the edge cases, which I guess Peter Lynch is being presented as? What do you make of this whole discussion?
That's a really interesting point about overreaction. Sometimes a disproportionate response is the right response, and the state has a role in handing down exemplary sentences as a deterrent. Now, compare us to France. In France, they riot every Wednesday. The last time we had comparable social unrest in this country, to a much greater scale, incidentally, was in 2011. And at that point, also, there was exemplary sentences handed down to 5,000 people who were arrested during those riots, which are much greater in scale and potency. And they followed the killing of Mark Duggan, as you'll probably remember, than what happened over the summertime. And also, it's interesting that to the data that I'm aware of those people who were sentenced, 70% in 2011 and about the same, perhaps a little bit more, in 2024, had previous criminal convictions. Now, it's important to say a couple of things about poor Mr. Lynch. Mm-hmm. First of all, he didn't have any previous convictions. This was his first time in custody. Now, you probably are aware, Tom, I used to be a prison governor, and I have opened the door on people who've taken their own lives. And we're not entirely sure yet whether that is the case, actually, because there needs to be an inquest, mm-hmm. and there needs to be an investigation by the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman. But the working assumption is that he took his own life, and that is a total tragedy. And I have, my sympathy extends to his family. There is an issue of saying, was that a disproportionate sentence for what he was involved in? And that's quite complex, actually, because he was part of an ecology during that riot, which was very, very serious and led to, around where he was, led to a hotel being set on fire with human beings inside it. The point I'd like to raise is a slightly different one, and that is, having dealt with managing suicidal people in custody, I think that given his age, given his infirmity, mm-hmm. He suffered from diabetes and angina, given the fact this was his first time in custody, and given the profile of the offence for which he was sentenced, he must have been surely considered to be screened for being at risk of suicide. There is a process called ACT, which is a national process in prisons. What I want to know is, there are other questions to answer, philosophically about whether he was sentenced or not, but were those processes put in place? Mm-hmm. Because I can tell you this, even today, the Chief Inspector of Prison released a report on Wandsworth, which was a red flag notification where effectively the Chief Inspector had walked out of Wandsworth because it was so awful. So our prisons are in chaos anyway. And that's the backdrop to what may have happened to poor Mr. Lynch.
And Paul, what was your take on this story when you saw it?
I have no particular issue with people who wreak havoc and violence on their community being sent to prison. I think people, if that's what they do, particularly people who set fire to hotels with innocent people inside, I think they deserve a very long stretch in prison, actually. Anyone who smashes up their community or inflicts violence on other people, yes, they deserve to see the inside of a prison cell, no question about it. My problem with this particular case is, as we know, he didn't attack anyone physically. I think that's been confirmed. He didn't physically attack anybody, this Peter Lynch. He clearly lost his rag at the protest that he was attending, and he shouted And he shouted some pretty unpleasant things. And he was, as Ian described it, part of that ecology of that particular incident. But I'm uncomfortable with the length of the sentence that this guy received, and some of the sentences that some other people involved in the protests, whether physically or online, have received. And I think there is a legitimate case to say that we are seeing a degree of selective justice, a selective tough justice, if you like. Because we all know, because we read the stories in the newspapers and we see them every day. I'm sure Ian sees them as much as probably more than anybody else. And it's extremely frustrating, I think, for many citizens in this country to see the number of cases where people who have committed serious crimes, pretty horrendous crimes, actually, in some cases, quite often walking free from court. They'll get a suspended sentence or they'll get a community order or whatever. And I wrote a piece on my Substack actually a few days ago where I compared Lucy Connolly, who was one of the other people who got sent to prison for a long time for something she said online, to a case where in the same month that she was arrested, a man was convicted because he beat up a complete stranger on a street in Lincolnshire. He punched him, he kicked him, he left him lying unconscious in the middle of the road. The victim suffered lasting damage, physical and psychological. And the assailant got a suspended sentence and walked free from court. I think that really angers people, actually. And I don't think it's necessarily that they support the rioters or they support what some people posted online, but they just think, well, hold on a second. We have been so ineffective as a country and so useless as a country, apprehending criminals, punishing criminals. We've got this, and I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it is a true one, I think. This soft touch justice system. And I think people do get angry with that. And especially as we see now with the recent early release of prisoners and all of the publicity around that and people coming out and being picked up by Bentleys and saying, thank you, Keir Starmer. And some of them have been found guilty of kidnapping and that's why they were in prison and so on. And I think there is a sense that some of these people are political prisoners. And I don't say that lightly, and probably political with a small p, but in the sense that they've been made examples of, probably for political reasons. I think there's a case to say that they probably do deserve that status in some cases.
I can't accept Paul's point, and I know he qualified it by saying small p, that these people in any way qualify as political prisoners. There's no ideology behind burning a library or looting a vape shop, frankly. A lot of people were caught up in nihilistic violence, that the people who were caught up in the violence didn't follow any particular ideology apart from their own self-interest when they were looting shops and robbing and so on. A lot of them were very bored. Some of it was mobilized by far-right neo-fascist sentiment, but quite a lot of that, we're now told by some of the research that's being done, was down to hostile state actor intervention, trying to sort of foment social disorder in the country, or extreme right-wing actors from outside the country. So I can't get there. I do think it is absolutely legitimate, though, for people to say, why is our criminal justice system so broken? Why is, for example, with criminal activity, behavior so disconnected from consequence? And I'm talking about criminal behavior generally speaking. Places where I come from, a working class housing state where I come from in Northern Ireland, you see the social disintegration taking place there, where people, there's sort of zones of criminal impunity, as I would call them, well away from the kind of postcodes that middle-class criminologists live in, where people, the only authority that they see day to day, if they see any at all, is a parking attendant with a stab vest on. Community policing has all but disintegrated. The little corner shops, which were the glue that held these communities together, are being overwhelmed by people who commit multiple, shoplifting to feed a drug addiction. When you're marooned in that postcode and you then see people who are treated in this way, it certainly will get propagandized and is being propagandized. But, as always with propaganda, there's a core of truth in it. And I think, we've got disconnected communities, and, we're often told about Muslim communities in the northeast of England, around some of the middle towns that seem to be disconnected from mainstream British life. I think the same applies to some places that have got white communities that feel disconnected, where the community morale has been shattered and so on. And we need to find a way, if we're going to stop riots happening again, and if we're going to not need these exemplary prison sentences, which seemed to have an effect in 2011. I don't know if that's going to be the case now. In order to deal with some of the consequences. And so much of the rioting and violence and disorder that happened this time round absolutely maps places socioeconomically where they're in the skin.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And it's also worth saying that there were a lot of things around in 2011, which I think were fair cause for concern. Instances of young men who just set up a Facebook group calling for disorder. No one ever attended, and they both got 4 years in prison. This is a pattern that we've seen repeat itself before. And if we're to be consistent, I suppose we should reflect on that slightly. But Paul, we're fast running out of time. I want to get onto Trump and fascism and all that good stuff. But is there anything short that you want to add here before we move on?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I go some way with Ian on what you just said. I mean, there was certainly an element of nihilism about it, where people just did for the sake of it. In many cases, I think went out and smashed up their community because that's just what they decided to do. But I do think actually that for many people who, not the worst of the idiots who caused the violence, but maybe some people who went onto the streets and millions of people who didn't go onto the streets, there is a burning sense of resentment in some of those communities that may not always be articulated particularly well. And it's almost like an inchoate kind of movement, force, if you like, but it exists. There is an awful lot of unhappiness and resentment and tension in many of our communities over issues like economic injustice and crime and immigration and integration and social disintegration.